Okay, well, let's get started for the day. What we want to talk about today is this Keynesian model of the economy. You'll remember last time I went through this sort of debate that took place between the classical economists who came earlier, and I mentioned a few names to you. Let me just kind of mention a few of those same names again. But Adam Smith was, you'd consider a classical economist. Adam Smith was the father of modern economics. What he did, the work he did really was the same type of work that economists nowadays do, and he was the first one to sort of put it all together. So anyway, Adam Smith, classical economist. Later on, I mentioned this guy named Say, J.B. Say, and there was Say's law, which you'll remember that term was supply creates its own demand. I mentioned, I think, Alfred Marshall, who we had talked about earlier back in the supply and demand chapter. And basically what happened before Keynes came along was economists had this theory of how the economy worked, and they basically said you cannot have a prolonged recession or a depression. They used the term a glut and used even a modifier. You cannot have a general glut. Now, what's a glut? Surplus. And so when they talked about you cannot have a general glut, this would have been the classical economists. What they're saying is this: you cannot have a situation where there's just goods and services out there that can't be sold. A surplus of everything. Can't have it. Why not? If there is a surplus, and now here we'll go back to a diagram that we had before, we have supply and demand, and if there's a surplus where quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, price will fall. And as price falls, we get rid of the surplus. If it happened to be a surplus of labor, it'd be wages that fall. If there happened to be a surplus of capital or a surplus of funds, interest rates would fall. But the point is that you cannot have a general glut, and the reason you can't, said the classical economists, we depend on wage and price flexibility. We'll clear that market with declining wages or prices. Along comes Keynes in 1936 is when he wrote this book. What book? Well, I'm glad you asked. What is it? It's got a long name. General Theory of Interest, Employment, and Money. Economists just call it the general theory. He wrote the book in 1936. I told you wrong last time. I think I told you 1887. He was born in 1883 and then died in 1946. But anyway, along comes Keynes. He says, well, you know, that's a good theory you got about, you classical economists, that's a good theory you've got about how there can't be a general glut, can't be a surplus of all goods. But he says, even though you got that good theory, it doesn't work in practice. Because I've been looking at England all through the 1920s. I've been looking at the England also in the 1930s, the United States in the 1930s. The world's got a general glut. And following wages and prices does not seem to have solved the problem. And so I've got a different explanation, and that explanation really forms the foundation of what economists think of today as macroeconomics. The stuff that economists were doing before Keynes was more of microeconomics as applied to macro type of problems, supply and demand. And so along comes Keynes. He says it's not supply and demand. His wages and prices won't fall, for one thing. And another thing, your theory, you classical economists, your theory doesn't explain how this glut came to be. I know how the glut came to be. And so his story of the general glut, he says that there is deficient spending, which we nowadays would call aggregate demand, causes recessions, or that glut, that general glut. We don't say that word glut very much anymore, do we? Anyway, Keynes says it was deficient spending that causes the problem. What's the solution? Well, the solution's kind of obvious, isn't it? And we don't have to study this very long in order to guess the solution. If deficient spending or deficient aggregate demand causes this recession, then increase aggregate demand or increase spending, that will get rid of the recession. And that's basically Keynes' story. Now, it's a pretty elegant story, and we'll talk about it in greater detail, but the point is, that's really what he gets around to saying, is that there's not enough spending in the economy, increase the spending. And who's going to increase it? And the answer is government, because the private sector is the one that's not spending enough. That was Keynes' story. And we'll come back with that later on. But I wanted to stop and talk about Keynes because this was really, when he was writing this book, this was overturning the established beliefs about how the macroeconomy worked. As I say, there was really no big picture of the macroeconomy. There was a little bit, but it was not a general understanding. And so then Keynes came along and said, hey, here's a different way of looking at it. And since then, economics has never been the same. That's really when economics turned into macro and micro. And I mean in a real obvious way. In Keynes's model, the emphasis is on the relationship between total expenditures, which we already talked about, and total production. We'll talk about total expenditure some more, but I'm saying that back in earlier when we talked about aggregate demand, I already used that term total expenditures. Here's what total expenditures were. But I'm saying these are the two things that Keynes emphasizes in this model. Total expenditures, consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. What was what? Consumption, you've got this in your notes, consumption, spending by households, investment spending by businesses, and you remember what businesses spend or invest in. Really, we could think of three things. One is structures, and one is tools and equipment. And then third, and those two things, by the way, the structures and the tools and equipment, we add those up and call them fixed investment. And then the third thing is investment in inventories, changes in inventories. So anyway, consumption by households, investment by businesses, purchases of goods and services by government, and then net exports, which is exports minus imports. Okay. So anyway, there's the components of total expenditures. We already talked about these once, where I went through and sort of told you about, what durable and non-durable goods and services, and we talked about these to some extent. I want to talk about them a little bit more in a different way. What I want to do today is to talk about, for consumption especially, I want to talk about its relationship to the income of people. Again, let's come back over to consumption. You remember services plus durables, durable goods, plus non-durable goods. So that's what we're talking about, the magnitude. This is about 65 to 70% of total expenditures. So out of all the spending that we have in the economy, about 65 or 70% of that spending by households. Okay? Consumption is most heavily influenced by family income. After taxes. And now I want to write down something called a consumption function. It's just a mathematical relationship. C equals C0 plus MPC times YD. And I'll write down what all that stuff means here in a second, but you need to get that in your notes. First of all, YD. This is, the Y is equal to income. The D means disposable. And so disposable income is what we're talking about here. And we talked about that, it's been a couple, 3 weeks ago now. but we talked about disposable income where you start off with the gross domestic product and you start subtracting numbers and adding a few, but mainly subtracting and work our way down through national income and personal income. And from personal income, we subtract taxes, personal taxes, and that gives us disposable income. So anyway, that's disposable income. MPC, this is the marginal propensity to consume. You can see, I guess, where the MPC comes from. What does that mean? Here's what it means, and you can think about this in a real simple way, is if you get another dollar's worth of income, you go to work today, you earn another dollar, what percent of that dollar do you spend? It's the percent of an additional dollar of income that you would spend. Okay? For example, if the MPC is 0.75, and I'll put that up here just as an example, if that MPC is 0.75, that says if you get one more dollar's worth of income, you'll spend 75 cents. And what do you do with the other 25 cents? And the answer is not spend it, or else the MPC would have been bigger. But if you don't spend it, we would call that saving, because if you remember, disposable income is either spent or it's not spent, in which case it's saved. So anyway, if the MPC was 0.8, then that says every additional dollar of income, I spend 80 cents out of that dollar, I would save now 20 cents. So you get the idea. So the MPC, and by the way, I've said it the right way each time, but maybe you weren't hearing me right, so be sure and have it clear in your notes. The MPC is, that's the percent of each additional dollar of income that you would spend, or incremental dollar. It's not on average of all the dollars of income, it's one more dollar. How much would you spend of that dollar? Okay. And so, by the way, what we're doing here is, I'll come back and give this a name in a second. We want to talk about this C0 as autonomous consumption spending. C0, autonomous consumption spending. Autonomous. You know, if you hear about somebody who is autonomous, they're kind of got an independent personality, kind of go their own way. And that's what autonomous means here also. A moment ago, we were talking about spending 75 or 80 cents out of another dollar's worth of income, and that's important. But now we're talking about spending dollars, but it has nothing to do with income. Autonomous, unrelated to income. If your income goes down, you'd spend less and less, but you wouldn't go down to the point of spending nothing, or else that would be the end of you. So there's something that we're going to spend no matter what. We go out and beg, borrow, or steal, but regardless of our income, I almost said irregardless, regardless of our income, we are going to spend some money, and that's the autonomous consumption spending. Or it doesn't have to be a person that's on the verge of starvation. There's some things, let's say you're going to spend $5 a day on food, just to pick a number out. $5 a day on food, come rain or come shine. Whether you're rich or poor, $5 a day. You always like to eat the same sandwich and the same whatever for lunch. And so there's $5, and that's independent of your income. Now, we can imagine different examples of that, but really what we're saying here is that with consumption, we've got two kinds of spending. This kind of spending that we call autonomous, and this other kind of spending that's related to income that we call induced spending. Induced by what? Induced by increases in income. Income goes up, spending goes up. Let's work with this consumption function and see what it tells us. Suppose that disposable income is 0. How much do people spend according to that formula? Well, you put a 0 in for disposable income, induced spending 0, but there's still $50 worth of autonomous consumption. Excuse me. Suppose disposable income is $100. How much do people spend? And the answer is, well, they spend 80% of the $100, which is 80, plus 50 is 130. Suppose income is $200. How much do people spend? 200, 80% of 200 is 160. You with me? That's the induced part, the 160. Plus 50, 210. Think you can do this for yourself now? $300, then what? 300 times 80% is 240. That's 240, that's induced consumption spending. 240 plus 50, 290. We'll do one more and quit. 400. 400 times 80% is 320. Plus 50, how much? 370. Is that right? Yeah. Here's what you ought to notice. Each time we've got another $100 worth of income, you can see that, but each time we go up by 80, 80, 80, 80, that marginal propensity to consume is regulating the rate at which consumption spending increases. My only problem is, for me, the marginal propensity to consume slightly over 100%. So every time I get like another dollar's worth of income, I spend $1 and a dime. And so, you know, deeper in debt. I'd be better off if I was, well, I am poor, so that wouldn't do it. But anyway, even more poor. Now, let's take these numbers and make a graph. We'll put them over here. Disposable income, consumption spending. Okay, so if income is 0, consumption spending is $50. Let's come up here to 50 bucks. And put a dot right there. $50 spending when income is 0. Let's say the income is $100. I better just mark these off in little segments. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so if income is $100, consumption spending 130. Is that right? Yeah, 130. If income is $200, consumption spending is how much? 210. $300 and $290 for consumption. That's nothing to sneeze at. And then $400, and what do we have up there? It's $370. Let's connect the dots. That's supposed to be a straight line. It's only my poor artwork that makes that look a little bit non-straight. This is a consumption function. What's the slope of this curve? Well, let's just pick 2 points on the curve. Here's point A and here's point B. Okay, slope equals the vertical distance between 2 points on the curve divided by the horizontal distance. The vertical distance from 210 to 290, $80. The horizontal distance from 200 to 300, $100 equals 0.8. Hey, the slope of this curve is equal to the MPC. What a wonderful thing. So if you see the slope of this curve is 0.8, the MPC is 0.8. If we had had a higher MPC, 0.9, this curve would have been steeper. It would have gone from, where are we here, 50 to 140, 230, well, you get the idea, 320, and so forth. So the MPC is equal to the slope of the consumption function. Okay? And also, we see the slope of the MPC, or the slope of the consumption function, right there in front of that disposable income term. You with me? Okay. Now, I want to tell you something, and you need to either remember it or make a note of it. I don't mean to confuse you, but it could be a little bit confusing. What we did in the previous materials, we did this. We started off with gross domestic product, and then we subtracted capital consumption allowance, and we had net domestic product, and then we subtract indirect business taxes, and we got national income, and then we subtracted a few things and added a couple things, and we got personal income. You remember all that? Sort of like a bad dream, right? Anyway, what we're going to do now, and I mean, we're not going to say that stuff is wrong, but we're going to make a simplifying assumption. We're going to assume for the time being that capital consumption allowance, that's kind of a small number compared to GDP anyway. You know, this is a few $billion versus GDP. I mean, it's quite a few $billion, but still not a huge number compared to GDP of $8–9 trillion. Same thing for indirect business taxes. We'll just say that's zero. And then these things here, these are a few $1 billion more or less. We'll assume those are zero. And once we make that assumption, why are we making this assumption? And the answer is to simplify, so we don't have to talk about every tiny little detail. But when we make that assumption, here's what's true now. GDP equals NDP equals NI, national income, equals PI, personal income. So we are at this point going to assume all these things are equal and not going to distinguish between them anymore, except for, you know, on tests, final exam, and so forth, we will still distinguish between them. But when we are drawing these pictures showing income down here on the horizontal axis, as Y, and we'll come back and use the Q again and real GDP and those terms. But what we're going to stop doing is we're going to stop distinguishing between these, as I say, not because there is no difference, there is, but because indirect business taxes, sales taxes paid by businesses, property taxes paid by businesses, those are not a big piece of the picture when we want to understand how the economy operates. So we just say, let's don't talk about those. Okay? And also, let me mention, this is an assumption, assume these things. Another thing is this, assume P equals P bar. That is to say, assume that there's no inflation. Now, whatever the price level is, it remains unchanged. This is Keynes's assumption. I didn't assume it. Keynes assumed it. CPI doesn't change. CPI with a bar over it. That doesn't mean every single price is unchanged. It means that the price level overall is not going up. The average price is not rising. Some prices up a little, some down a little, the average unchanged. Why did Keynes assume this? And the answer is, he was writing for the 1920s and 1930s when most of the industrialized world was in a recession or a depression. And during the time he was writing, it was true to say that there is no inflation. And so he was writing for a period of no inflation. So that's what we need to work with here in our discussion. So we've got a couple simplifying assumptions. And by the way, we'll come back and drop this assumption pretty quickly. The next unit of material that we go through, it will basically come back and say, hey, and that's what's wrong with Keynes's theory, is he assumed no inflation. He doesn't know how to deal with it, doesn't know how to explain it. And that is true to some extent also. So we will come back and drop this assumption later on. But for the time being, we have two assumptions that go against what we've already talked about in this class. And I don't want to get you confused by that, so be sure and keep that in mind for this sort of time being. Okay, what do we have? Oh, saving. Let's talk about saving. I don't see where I want to do that, so I'll say YD equals C plus S. A couple of weeks ago when we were going through the GDP accounts, we worked our way down from GDP to net domestic product, national income, personal income. And by the way, that's as far as we've gone here with that assumption. But the next step down was disposable income, which I am now calling Y sub D. And I said there's two things you can do. The personal income is all the family's income that it receives, whether it earns it or not, but just all income. And then we subtract taxes, personal taxes, and that gets us to disposable income. And after your taxes, you've got dollars you can do two things with. You can either consume those dollars, spend them, or not consume them. And if you don't consume dollars, we call that saving. That's just dollars you're putting in your savings account or buying stocks and bond with or putting into a mutual fund someplace or another. Saving is the part of your disposable income that's not spent. So now, let's see, I really want it over here. So S equals YD minus C. If you want to know how much people save, it's equal to their disposable income minus their consumption spending. All this is subtract C from both sides of the equation and flip it around so I get my S over here on the left. But consumption spending is equal to, and I'm going to put it in brackets here, C0 plus MPCYD. So, you know, and all I've done there is made a substitution of total consumption spending. Now I put in that consumption function that we had. And so, next step, saving is equal to, let's factor these out, minus C0. There's the minus C0. Plus YD, that's this first YD, minus MPCYD equals minus C0. You don't have to be able to do this on test day, just kind of have a clue where it came from. Plus YD times 1 minus MPC. Usually you see that the other way around, so let me turn it around. 1 minus MPC times YD. So here's the saving function. Took me a while to get there. We had a consumption function. Where did I write that down? Here we go. We had a consumption function. And now we have a saving function. And it really looks kind of similar to the consumption function. There's an autonomous component. It's whatever I spend that's independent of my income, then I save a negative amount that's exactly the same. I'm spending dollars, let's say over and above my income, then I must be dis-saving. Not negative, dis-saving. And then we had an MPC for the induced part of consumption spending, the MPC times disposable income. Well, we have a 1 minus the MPC times disposable income, but that's the induced part of saving. And you know, sometimes we take that 1 minus MPC out of there and we put in its place MPS. That's the whole thing in parentheses there. And MPS, marginal propensity to save. If you have $1 more worth of income, what percent of that dollar's worth of income do you save? Let's see if I can do these. If income is $0, then our saving equals minus 50 plus, and then that's 0. So it's minus 50. If income's $100, we save minus 50 plus, what do we have, a 0.80 plus 0.20. I really need to write this down someplace. I have a hard time counting change at the store, so I don't want to be doing too many of these in my head. Sorry about that. Here we go. The saving function is minus autonomous spending plus 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, which is the marginal propensity to save. in this particular case, is 20%. Okay, so let's go again with this. $100 worth of income, our saving is minus 50 plus 20% of $100 would be 20, so that's minus 30. If income is $200, our saving is minus 50 plus 20% of 200. Well, 20% of 200 is $40, so minus 50 plus 40 minus 10. By the way, you can kind of see that here is this minus this is minus 10. This minus this is minus 30, and so forth. What do we have here? Income's $300, so it's minus 50 plus 20% of 300 is $60, so it's plus 10. If income is $400, our saving is minus 50 plus 20% of 400. Well, 20% of 400 is $80, so 80 minus 50 plus 30. You know, I did this wrong twice, didn't I? MPS, MPC. Oh, look at that. Isn't that interesting? MPC plus MPS equals 1. Huh. What does that mean? It means, look, if I give you $1, there's a certain percent you're going to spend, there's a certain percent you're not going to spend that you're going to save, but those 2% have to add up to 100%. And so if I told you, oh, the marginal propensity to consume 0.55, you should know immediately that the marginal propensity to save 0.45. Right? You getting this?
Yeah.
Good. I am glad. Okay, now let's distinguish, let's talk about something a little bit different. Let's talk about the APC and the APS. I'm mainly going to tell you about these so you don't get them confused, but they're not really very important for our discussion. But you need to know what they are. Anyway, here's what the APC is. It's equal to consumption spending divided by disposable income. Here's the APS is equal to saving divided by disposable income. MPC equals change in spending, consumption spending, divided by a change in disposable income. Let's talk about the difference here. So far, I have been talking about the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save. And the real key to understanding these is that little delta sign up there. The words that go with this is the change in consumption spending per additional dollar's worth of income. So we're looking at the margin, an incremental dollar's worth of income. How much does my spending go up or down? Again, here, marginal propensity to save, it's a change in saving that results from a $1 change in income, an increment to income. Over here, which we are not talking about, is the average propensity to consume and the average propensity to save. And what we would do there, these are none of them too awful easy to deal with. Here we go. If we take this particular point, we say, look, spending is $370 and total income is $400. So that takes the average propensity to consume. It takes all consumption spending. This is total consumption spending, and it divides it by total disposable income. And what do we have here? This is about, it's greater than 90%. If I had my calculator, I could tell you exactly how much it is. But it's about 92.5% or something like that. Is that right? I'm going to say that's 92.5%. 0.925. I think that's correct. Here's what that says to me. Hey, out of all my income, I spend 92.5%. How much do I save? Well, they have to add up to 100% too, right? All your income's either spent or not spent. And so if we're spending 92.5%, we must be not spending 7.5%, assuming that my calculations are correct. They aren't really calculations so much as a stab in the dark. But assuming that my stab in the dark is correct, these things have to add up to 1 also. That's a big plus sign, isn't it? 1. They have to add up to 1, but again, there's a difference in interpretation. Let me say them again and then tell you again which one we are going to be putting the attention on, the emphasis. With the average, we take all of our income and ask how much of all income is spent. And here we're saying 92.5%. With the marginal propensity to consume, we're saying if I get one more dollar, an incremental dollars worth of income, how much of that do I spend? That is what we care about. The APC we don't care about, other than I'll probably put something on the test to see if you know the difference between the two. But we're never going to use the APC, and we're never going to use the APS to do, I don't think, anything again. It will only be there for the purpose of tricking you on test day. Well, gee, I've never been that honest before. Anyway, that's why it will be there. You need to be able to calculate it, because I may ask you a question, the APC is how much, and then I want to see if you're going to calculate it wrong. But don't ever come back again and say, oh, we're going to use that now. No, we're not. We're going to use the MPC and the MPS. Okay? Any questions about that? Okay, man, I don't know where I started with all this stuff. Yes, I do. I finished talking about consumption. And just before I started talking about consumption, here's what I had. TE equals C plus I plus G plus X in net exports. And I said, well, we want to talk about total expenditures. And all we've done really now is talk about one expenditure, consumption spending. But that's a big one. That's, what did I say, 65, 70% of total spending, total expenditures in the economy. For the time being, we're going to make a very simple assumption about investment spending. I is autonomous. Does not depend on changes in Y, or real GDP. By the way, I told you up here a while ago some of Keynes's assumptions. We're using this term right now, Y, for real GDP, and we're using that because that's what Keynes used. And so we have already become familiar with coming over here and putting real GDP or Q on the horizontal axis, and we'll return to that again. But Keynes used this letter Y, and so everybody that does Keynesian economics maintains the symbols that he used, and so there's a chance you'll get a little bit confused here, and I'll try and keep things straight for you. But anyway, just to let you know that this is not all new news. New news? It's really no such thing as old news, is there? This is not all new information to you, this Y stuff. It's just a different symbol. Okay, so autonomous, and that is to say, here's what we're going to assume about investment spending. Let's put Y here on the horizontal axis, or Q, or real GDP. And what we'll assume is this: it's autonomous. It does not depend on or reflect changes in the level of real GDP. Real GDP can go up or it can go down, and autonomous spending is, I don't know, let's say $50, well, I already used 50. Let's say $60 is autonomous investment spending. Businesses just spend $60, or $60 billion if you like, 60 trillion if you like big numbers. Okay? A third type of spending, government spending, we're going to make exactly the same assumption. Government spending, these are government purchases of goods and services. We will assume for the time being, this is to make the model simple, to make it where we can sort of get in here and manipulate something. We're going to assume, manipulate the model is what we need to do. And to make it easier to manipulate, we will make these assumptions about autonomous government spending. And finally, net exports. In order to make the discussion simple, We're going to say that net exports are autonomous, do not depend on the level of gross domestic product or incomes in the economy. Now what I need is a little bit of board space, and I'm going to erase, but I'm going to redraw this curve just being smaller. And we're going to do a little bit of graphical work to accompany these words that I've been throwing out here. I'm going to draw them small because I have several of these graphs to draw. Autonomous investment. I'll get that 0 out of there. This little 0 we put next to the C for consumption, that told us that was autonomous. It does not depend on income. Here's I with a subscript 0. It means the same. It's the amount of investment spending if income are 0. G0. Now let's do one more. How am I going to put a subscript down there? 0. So there are the components of total expenditures, C plus I plus G plus X in. And the last graph we draw down here on the bottom, let me get on my knees. Here's what we want to do is we want to add all those together. Okay, so let's say if income is Y1 or GDP is Y1, then what we would do is draw a vertical line. And the reason we're adding these together, TE equals C plus I plus G plus X net exports. So what we want to do is add all those together. And if the level of income is Y1, then how much is net exports? Well, it's this autonomous amount. How much is government spending? Again, the autonomous amount. How much is net exports? How much is investment spending? The autonomous investment spending. How much is consumption? It's this much, which is the autonomous consumption plus a little bit of induced consumption spending. So we would come and add all those amounts up, and we get a certain dot right here. And let me put some dollar amounts on this to make it like, here's $70. Oh, we already had an amount, didn't we? 130. 130. Did I say an amount for this? $60, $30, $20. Okay, so let's add them up. And consumption spending is 130 plus 60 is 190 plus 30 is 220 and 240. And if income is, and that was $100, wasn't it? Let's say income is, we'll pick $300 now. Draw a vertical line and ask how much consumption spending. Well, at $300 income, consumption spending was, what do I have, 290? 290 plus 60 is 350. Plus 30 is 380. Plus 20, $400. Wow, that was great. You get the idea. And then we would come along and connect the dots. And this is total expenditures. Equals vertical summation of C plus I plus G plus Xn. How much is this amount right here? This is autonomous total expenditures, isn't it? This point right here, where the total expenditures curve touches the vertical axis, this is 20 and 30 is 50, and 60 is 110, and 50 is $160. Questions about this? You may have questions about why in the world would we do this, but anyway, the idea is what we've been doing is talking about the components, individual components of total expenditures. And now what we're doing is we've got a graph for each one of these components. And this is a very simple case where everything's autonomous except for consumption, but that's what we need in order to understand how the model works. Anyway, we've got a graph for each one of these components, and now we use this process called vertical summation. You see the vertical is we've got a vertical line, and we add the heights of all those curves together to get the total expenditures curve. Okay, so that is a graph of total expenditures. And by the way, it's not where we're going with this, but if you'll remember what we talked about previously when total expenditures were brought up, we were bringing total expenditures into the story of talking about aggregate demand. And so the idea would be that if the price level would change, total expenditures would change, and then that would give the aggregate demand curve that downward slope that we talked about before. If you remember, we have at price level P1, there's a certain level of aggregate demand, and then a certain quantity demanded of real GDP. And then if the price level went down, people would buy more. Well, that's true, but now we've got a fixed amount of price level, or we've got a fixed price level by assumption, and so we don't have to come back to that whole story of aggregate demand. It makes no sense to draw this aggregate demand curve if you always assume that there's a fixed price level. What does it mean to draw an aggregate demand curve at all different price levels? And the answer is it's not very meaningful. You're really then just kind of talking about a point on the aggregate demand curve. That's not a very good model for this situation. This one will work for us. Okay. The next piece of the puzzle is total production. If you go back in your notes and look, what I said was, and Keynes's model emphasizes the interplay between total expenditures and total production, which I will abbreviate TP, total production. I'm going to draw a graph for total production first. Here's Y or Q or real GDP, value of total production. You're going to like this one. Suppose that GDP, real GDP is, let's say, $100. What's the value of total production in the economy? Anybody? What does GDP mean? It's a value of total production, isn't it? So if real GDP, or Y if you like, if that's $100, the value of total production, that's $100. Huh, that's pretty simple. If real GDP is instead $200, how much is the value of total production? I think this one's coming to you pretty fast, isn't it? $200. If I draw a line for total production, TP, this is a 45-degree line. That is to say, the slope is 1. It goes over 1 unit, up 1 unit. From here to here, there's 100 units on the run, there's 100 units on the rise, the slope equals 1. And this angle here is 45 degrees. So that's our total production curve. Let me just write one thing down here. This is telling us that there's passive supply. And that's what we'll pick up with next time, is this idea of supplying goods. So long, I'll see you next time.